The lady's had her bag stolen. I'm a locksmith. Can you explain to me what I'm meant to do, please? Tell her I can't park here, we can't let you in.
Struggles we know.
I'm absolutely broke, and I'm not really bothered because it's something I wanted so much.
Dreams we have.
When you want something so much, you just like, you play with fire a bit to get it, don't you?
Fears we share.
I'm the boss. Sweeping up, and I'm the boss. Someone's got to do it, and it's got to be me. You know, sometimes I look at it and I think, is it worth it?
Join the people of Paddington Green tomorrow at 9:30 on BBC1. This Saturday, things get a little sticky for Nikki.
She's our head rep,
I missed you so much.
and he's the manager of one of our most important hotels.
I never meant to hurt you.
If they were to get it on, she'd get the sack.
Sunburn, Saturday 5 to 9 on BBC1.
Now, just ahead of BBC News 24, the weather details from Isobel Lang.
Hello there. Well, there's some unsettled weather on the way, but actually for the rest of tonight, it's calming down. There's just a few showers around the coast, but temperatures are plummeting, and we could see a frost just about anywhere, really. And there is a risk of some icy patches, especially on untreated roads. So that's something we'll keep an eye on through the morning. Here's the next system, though, starting to push in across Ireland by the end of the night. And as that moves through western parts of Britain during this morning, well, we'll see increasingly wet and windy weather. And in fact, that rain preceded by some sleet and snow over the Pennines and up across the higher parts of Scotland. A few centimetres of snow possible over the Scottish mountains. As that continues to push through, though, we'll see things turning a little bit brighter and more showery out to the west through the afternoon and evening. Also, we'll start to see a snow thaw, particularly through the Highlands, so that's something we'll be keeping a close watch on for you, and we'll keep you updated on that snow melt. It'll also feel quite cold in the wind, with southerly gales developing out to the west. We're looking at quite a cold feel until the end of the day, when temperatures will eventually reach around about 8 or 9 degrees. Good night.
Nearly 5 years after the death of apartheid, I've come back to South Africa to try to find out how much life has changed for the black majority. Back then I met Cynthia Mtebe, a mother who lived in a makeshift tent with her children. She didn't even have one of these tin shacks. I'm here to find Cynthia and to see what's happened to her and the thousands like her who lived on the margins of existence, looking for the promised land.
Panorama, tomorrow at 10 on BBC1.
Through the night, now on BBC One, we join BBC News 24.
You're watching BBC News. NATO's meeting in Brussels came after fighting broke out around the Serbian village of Račak, where the 45 ethnic Albanians were massacred. Serbian police fired automatic weapons and mortars from the surrounding hills, and units were seen moving into the village. Civilians fled the area as international monitors were ordered out.
Račak is a village paralysed by grief. Fathers and sons lie together, some 40 bodies filling the mosque. The Serbian authorities say these were armed terrorists, but there were no uniforms here. The bodies bore the signs of summary execution, not of a battle. They killed my father, this little girl says over and over, inconsolable after emerging from the mosque. Grief here is turning to anger. The Serbs could have done little more to increase support for the rebel Kosovo Liberation Army. OSCE monitors first negotiate a pullback of the ethnic Albanian rebels, the KLA.
The Unuchika are just on the other side of us. The entire group is stopped.
But the monitors' pleas to the Yugoslav authorities for restraint are ignored. Police and army units take up positions above the village, a steady build-up of forces throughout the day. Machine gun, cannon and mortar fire mark the police advance. It wasn't clear if the KLA were returning fire. The villagers are sent fleeing. The monitors have pulled back. They are alone. They're shooting at our village, he says. We're scared they'll kill us like they killed the others. The OSCE mission is verifying a ceasefire which exists in name only. While the international community considers punitive action against Belgrade, on the ground both sides seem increasingly intent on pursuing their aims by force of arms, not at the negotiating table. Paul Wood, BBC News, Kosovo.
Earlier, I spoke to John Roper of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. I began by asking him why NATO doesn't want to take military action.
It was impossible to make a decision at this stage for military action. They've sent two of their most senior military people to Belgrade to see whether they can persuade Milosevic to move. Then they'll have to come back and consider military action again. But I think there may be resistance to taking this military action without a United Nations mandate, even though the formal decision is still in place.
Presumably the situation is also complicated by the fact you have unarmed monitors on the ground and they've already been attacked.
Yes, whether the military action would be taken in Kosovo or whether it would attack the Serbia in some other way, we don't know. But presumably the monitors, the verifiers, would have to come out before one started bombing.
I suppose the question is, what exactly would it take for NATO to actually bomb? There have been warnings and threats before, but they've never actually done it.
I think NATO would have to think of a complete new strategy, because it wouldn't just be a question of bombing. One would have to think what one did afterwards, and that, of course, is the problem. Would one be prepared to put ground forces into Kosovo in the way that they've gone into Bosnia? Which countries would be prepared to do this? The British Prime Minister has said he was frustrated one didn't have forces available to go into Kosovo earlier in the year. It's not clear whether they're available now. Certainly, there's not too much enthusiasm.
What about diplomacy? I mean, NATO is sending these two senior officers to Belgrade. Could that be the way?
Well, I think one has to look at the political parameters into which this is going to fit. Quite clearly, after this sort of conflict, it looks less and less likely that there will be agreement. The Kosovans are not going to come back under Belgrade, and therefore it seems to me that the parameters, the limits within which the negotiations are carried out will have to be reconsidered, perhaps looking at the unthinkable, the idea of eventual independence for Kosovo.
And very briefly, do you feel that NATO are in any way going to be able to avoid what they've been trying to avoid all along, which is another Bosnia?
Well, I mean, Bosnia at the moment is a relative success. What we don't want to have is to have the 3 bad years of Bosnia repeated in Kosovo, and that's going to be quite difficult.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin is in hospital again. This time he's being treated for a bleeding stomach ulcer. A Kremlin spokesman said Mr. Yeltsin's condition was stable and that he would remain in hospital for the next few days while treatment was carried out. Last week, the Russian president failed to return to the Kremlin for what was supposed to be his first working day since the Christmas and New Year holiday.
It was not an auspicious start to Boris Yeltsin's new year. The Russian president had been promising a political fight back, but tonight finds himself back in Moscow's Central Clinical Hospital, suffering from a perforated ulcer. His spokesman appeared on television to assure the Russian people there was no cause for concern.
The president is in a stable condition. He's been confined to bed, but there's no question of him giving up any of his powers.
Cynics will respond that they've heard optimistic reports like that before. Past colds have subsequently turned into heart conditions or pneumonia. The irony is that Boris Yeltsin had been attempting to reassert his authority. On Saturday, he met the Internal Affairs Minister to discuss crime. This latest illness leaves him looking weaker than ever. The Russian president's health has never fully recovered since undergoing multiple bypass heart surgery in November 1996. Last year, his failing health sidelined him from politics. He almost collapsed on a visit to Central Asia, was subsequently hospitalized with pneumonia, and then spent weeks away from the Kremlin recovering. President Yeltsin had been planning a state visit to France at the end of this month, part of an attempt to show he's back at the center of power. Instead, he almost certainly faces growing demands for him to resign. Even his erstwhile allies are beginning to desert him. Robert Parsons, BBC News, at the Central Clinical Hospital, Moscow.
Well, a short while ago I discussed Boris Yeltsin's latest health scare with the Russian analyst Alan Shipman. I asked him what the prospects for the president were.
I think Yeltsin will stay in power while he's still alive, and certainly his health record is bad, but he is a survivor. There's no sign of him giving up before the next election due still in 2 years' time. But we are seeing him also being eased out of power by the government, which, although weak, is there with more continuity and more authority the more Yeltsin is away from the scene.
So does that mean that in a sense they are preparing for the worst, for what happens after he's gone?
We're seeing the vultures circling, the would-be presidents beginning to declare themselves now, including Lebed and Lushkov, the two leading candidates, and others. We're also seeing the government making use of this to exert day-to-day authority, to assume more powers from the president. And in that sense, it is a constructive evolution of a constitution which traditionally was much weighted towards the president and did have to change.
There was a lot of fear, certainly in earlier months and previous illnesses, that Yeltsin was very much the figurehead of the government and that without him there was a vacuum. Is that then changing?
There are signs of the government drifting in Yeltsin's absence. Now, this could be because the tasks confronting the government are so great that it would have drifted anyway. But without a central figure asserting authority, things do move more slowly, and there are some very important decisions coming up, primarily the budget and the attempt to get IMF support restarted.
I mean, indeed, what is the situation? I mean, in Russia, if you have a president in this case who's hardly ever at work, I mean, how unstable is Moscow at the moment?
Well, Moscow itself is stable because it has strong leadership within the city, and this is true of a number of other regions now, which are also asserting themselves in the absence of a strong central government authority. But ultimately, a strong figure of some sort at the centre is needed to force certain measures through, and Yeltsin is not as able to do that as he was. There is the further problem that when he comes back from illness, traditionally he causes more instability by dismissing people. He used to sack prime ministers. Last time he sacked his own chief of staff. There again, his power is diminishing, but you never quite know what he will do to try to reassert himself when he returns.
2 Britons and a Dutch family of 4 have been kidnapped by tribesmen in Yemen. Reports from there say they are hospital workers who were travelling in convoy from the north of the country to the relative safety of the capital. It's the 3rd time British citizens have been kidnapped in Yemen in less than a month.
The hills of Yemen are an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable place, especially for Westerners. Kidnapping has become commonplace. The British Embassy has this weekend urged all UK citizens whose presence here is not essential to leave immediately. Those kidnapped today were travelling from the northern city of Sadr, where it's thought that the British couple and Dutch family have been part of a voluntary aid mission. On the road towards the capital, Sana'a, the small convoy was stopped. Their vehicles have been found abandoned. The tribesmen of Yemen are almost all well armed. Some, though, are also highly disaffected with the government and have increasingly used hostages as bargaining chips. Ransoms have been paid. In some cases, it's been reported that new roads have been built in exchange for hostage releases. In almost all cases, the captives have returned home physically unharmed. That was not the case with a group of tourists seized just after Christmas. They were caught up in a gun battle between the kidnappers and the security forces. These survivors saw 4 of their friends killed in the shooting. It was a new and sinister departure, not least because their captors were, it seems, politically motivated Islamic fundamentalists. The case of British engineer John Brooke, who was released from captivity in Yemen last week, had no such political or religious overtones. The hope is that this latest case will prove equally simple, and that the 4 adults and 2 children will soon be free. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Yemen.
The American Senate has been on arrest day after Republican prosecutors finished presenting their case in the impeachment trial of President Clinton. They said he'd violated the trust of the American people and dishonored the presidency. And they told the Senate that if it didn't find President Clinton guilty, the office of president would be permanently damaged. White House lawyers present their case this week. The Palestinian authorities have released dozens of Hamas and Islamic Jihad members held in prison for more than a year without trial. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat ordered their release to mark the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Israel has criticized the releases and demanded that Mr. Arafat continue a crackdown on militants in accordance with recent peace agreements. You're watching BBC News. A reminder of the headlines. Fresh outbreaks of fighting have been reported in the Yugoslav province of Kosovo. Meanwhile, NATO leaders have condemned the massacre of 45 villagers, but say they won't launch fresh airstrikes against the Serbs. 6 foreign nationals have been kidnapped in Yemen. The 2 Britons and members of a Dutch family, including 2 young children, were seized by armed tribesmen as they were travelling in the north of the country. And coming up, Russian Christians flock to see what many are calling a miracle, a weeping icon of the last Tsar. The Cuban leader Fidel Castro has hosted a meeting with his counterparts from Colombia and Venezuela, Andres Pastrana and Hugo Chavez, on ways of bolstering the peace process in Colombia. Afterwards, the three men expressed hope for a lasting and stable peace in Colombia following 4 decades of civil war. Because of their left-wing sympathies, the Cuban and Venezuelan leaders may be asked to play a direct role in formal peace talks taking place between the government and Marxist guerrillas. Well, joining me on the line now from Havana is our correspondent there, Tom Gibb. Tom, what can Castro and Chavez hope to achieve?
I think what Andres Pastrana, the Colombian president, wants is that they make themselves available to be part of a group that he's setting up called the Group of Friends, who would be sort of guarantors of the peace process. They're particularly important because they're two people that the guerrillas in Colombia have some respect for. Fidel Castro, of course, in Cuba, armed and trained left-wing guerrillas across Latin America for several decades. That policy ended with the Cold War, but nevertheless, particularly Fidel Castro retains a great deal of respect amongst the Colombian guerrillas.
Has there been any specific outcome from this three-way meeting?
Well, both Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez from Venezuela have said that they will support the peace process and have said that they're willing to act in this group of friends. Fidel Castro said he was reluctant to take a role as a protagonist in the talks. Some people have been suggesting that he might be a mediator, and he was playing down that idea. He said that the talks, if they were going to be successful, would have to be discreet, and making it fairly clear he wants a sort of behind-the-scenes role rather than a direct public role in the whole thing.
All right, Tom Gibb in Havana, thank you very much. Angola's government has accused the UNITA rebel movement of exacerbating the country's enormous refugee problem with its recent campaign of attacks. The war between government and rebel forces resumed on December the 4th. The United Nations estimates that 1.3 million people have been displaced by the conflict.
This is what's left of Angola's second largest city. On a strategic road and railway line, Quito was a prime target. The rebel offensive began in December. 50,000 people died here in 1993 and 1994. The city has never recovered. The recent fighting has taken a heavy toll on the civilian population.
Então, a quarta e a quinta foram logo 2 bombas caíram aqui.
The fourth and fifth bombs hit the top of my house. I was safe with my family in the bunkers, but we've lost everything.
At the city's hospital, the situation is desperate. Medical supplies for these people are almost gone.
The primary problem here is a shortage of food that we have to feed the patients. A lot of hospital equipment has been looted, including surgical equipment and mattresses and blankets.
The World Food Programme has resumed aid flights to some areas of Angola, but it won't come to Quito because of security fears. UN staff were among the casualties in recent attacks on aircraft flying over rebel areas. The situation is as desperate across much of Angola. This sprawling refugee camp in the town of Cachito has grown out of nothing in recent weeks. 13,000 people have fled here to escape the fighting.
They attacked us with machetes, but we escaped. We walked for 4 days to get here.
Angola's 4-year peace lies in tatters. The mandate of the country's UN observer mission ends in February. When the observers go, Angola will be left in isolation. David Brown, BBC News.
French politicians will meet later today to approve a constitutional amendment allowing Paris to cede some sovereignty to the European Union by ratifying the Amsterdam Treaty. The move has enraged French nationalists who took to the streets of Versailles on Sunday to protest.
The leader of France's right-wing National Front, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and several thousand supporters turned out to protest against the Amsterdam Treaty. The march took place in Versailles, close to the former royal palace, where members of France's National Assembly and Senate will vote to amend the constitution and so pave the way for ratification of the treaty. The treaty itself, drawn up in October 1997, includes moves to open borders between every EU state except Britain and Ireland by 2004, as well as new common policies on immigration and asylum, and increased cooperation between national police forces. The National Front, though, says it hides the real goal of a federal Europe.
Traité d'Amsterdam, après le traité de Maastricht.
The Treaty of Amsterdam, after the Treaty of Maastricht, is surreptitiously preparing for, without the French people knowing it, a federal Europe, in which France will lose its sovereignty as a nation and probably won't have any power anymore, less even than certain states of the American Union.
Dans la Fédération américaine des USA.
And it's not just the extreme right which is concerned. While the launch of the euro earlier this month strengthened popular support for a stronger Europe, politicians from many parties remain split over the dilution of national sovereignty. Despite their concerns, a 3/5 majority will be enough to adopt the amendment and allow France to become the 11th country to endorse the Amsterdam Treaty. If, as expected, the amendment is cleared, it would open the door for France to give the final go-ahead to the treaty in March. Andy Beat, BBC News.
The former president of Zimbabwe, the Reverend Canaan Banana, is due to be sentenced on Monday at court in Harare. Mr. Banana was found guilty on 11 counts of homosexual assault, mostly on former bodyguards when he was head of state in the early 1980s. Last year, he fled the country to South Africa, where he met President Nelson Mandela. Mr. Banana agreed to return to Zimbabwe after a meeting between Mr. Mandela and the Zimbabwean president, Robert Mugabe. The Brazilian finance minister and new central bank president have ended a second day of talks with the IMF and US Treasury officials about the country's financial strategy. The Brazilian officials attended the review at the International Monetary Fund headquarters in Washington after the shock devaluation of their currency, the real. The Brazilian government is due to announce new exchange rules on Monday. It's been reported that a new volcanic island is emerging from the Pacific Ocean near the Kingdom of Tonga. The island is said to be 30 miles to the north of Tonga's capital, Nuku'alofa. It's currently believed to be 200 to 300 meters long and 30 to 40 meters high. Tonga has a long history of these islands, which often disappear again after a number of years. Russian Orthodox Christians are flocking to a Moscow church to witness what many say is a minor miracle, a weeping icon of Russia's murdered Tsar, Nicholas II. The senior cleric at the Ascension Church in the Russian capital claims the icon oozes a steady flow of myrrh practically every day, and he believes this evidence of a miracle is enough to qualify the murdered Russian Tsar for canonization.
This is the Ascension Church in the Russian capital, Moscow. It's here that Orthodox believers have been flocking to witness a weeping icon of Russia's murdered Tsar Nicholas II. Many believe it's a minor miracle. Archpriest Vasily Golovanov claims the icon oozes a steady flow of myrrh almost every day. The myrrh, an oily amber-coloured substance, is said to have a subtle smell, which is more noticeable on days when services are held for the murdered royal family. One parishioner is convinced it's a miracle.
One of the miraculous events you can see here in this church is the miraculous evaporating fog which appears on the glass. The icon makes miracles.
The Russian Orthodox Church stipulates proof of a miracle as one of its conditions for sainthood. So far, the icon has received no official recognition from the Russian Orthodox Church and its leader, Patriarch Alexei II. The priest says an elderly parishioner took the icon of Tsar Nicholas to the church on November the 7th last year, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
The icon came to us during a service on the evening of the 7th. They brought it to the church. It smelled very strongly. It really is a miraculous phenomenon. It's inexplicable by physical laws.
Since then, hundreds of witnesses are said to have witnessed the flowing myrrh. Golovanov says this evidence of a miracle should be enough to qualify the murdered Russian royal family for canonization.
It's an encouraging signal. Russia must be reborn around the Orthodox Church and the Tsar.
Nicholas II and the Russian royal family were gunned down in a cellar in the town Yekaterinburg in July 1918. Their bones were finally buried in a ceremony in St. Petersburg last summer. David Campanelli, BBC News.
A reminder of the headlines. The NATO alliance has decided against any military action at an emergency meeting to consider its response to the killing of more than 40 ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. However, NATO ambassadors decided to send 2 top military officers to Belgrade. Serbian security forces earlier opened fire on the village in southern Kosovo where the killings took place on Friday. And the Russian President Boris Yeltsin is in hospital again, this time being treated for a bleeding stomach ulcer. The Kremlin said Mr. Yeltsin's condition was stable and that he would remain in hospital for the next few days while treatment was being carried out. You're watching BBC News.
Well, let's just take a look at this chart because this is how we start the coming week. Low pressure, as you can see, very much in control. It looks very much like the chart we had through most of last week with lots of isobars bringing strong gale force winds at times, driving the weather systems fairly rapidly eastwards to start the week. And there's going to be more change coming in. Look up to the west, upstream, we can see more areas of low pressure, more weather fronts lining up to head in across the United Kingdom. So a windy and in places a wet start to this week. Let's just follow the first sequence through. Here comes the rain, early hours of Monday morning, midday into the west, afternoon across all parts, then to be followed by clearer skies and bringing some showers through as well. It does mean for this morning we're going to see a bit of a clear start across much of England, Wales and Scotland, so frosty in places and may well be some icy stretches on some of the minor untreated roads, but out to the west the wind's freshening up, the clouds coming in, temperatures are rising, and this rain is going to be in across Northern Ireland to start the day. Now by the middle part of the morning across Northern Ireland beginning to push into the western part of Scotland, England and through into Wales, and by the midday, as you can see, a little bit of a white indication there, so that rain turning to snow over some of the hills and the mountains in the north and indeed in the northwest. The wind's certainly freshening up. Notice the number of isobars on the chart, so there will be gales for a time in the western fringes. But I think this day doesn't in fact start too bad in the east. Dry, sunny spells through the morning. The cloud though thickening up from the west, that rain pushing in to all western locations through the morning, preceded by some snow in the north and the northwest. The rain across to all parts through the afternoon and into Monday evening, and then followed by brighter skies bringing some showers in from the west. You can see the gales there, but not too bad a day temperature-wise. Top figures in the south and west about 9 or 10 degrees. Let's just take a look at some sporting action. If you're heading off to the race meetings, 3 taking place, Doncaster, Southall and Plumpton. It looks like the morning will be fine, but I think the afternoon we're all going to see that rain crossing the race meetings, so the drive home, perhaps some of the running a bit damp in the afternoon. Football-wise, well, down Aston Villa, Everton, looks like it's going to be reasonably fine in the evening as hopefully the rain passes away.
Revealing conversation and surprising comment with another newsmaker of the day in Hardtalk, next on BBC News 24.
The finest smell in the world, fish. Snip it up your nostril, you can't beat it.
Get the taste for a fishy world.
Brilliant escapes me life. Oh, I love the market.
What do they weigh, Joe? Well, don't keep throwing them on the...
With you, you sleep it, you eat it, you drink it.
It's even your lucky day because I'm going to do your deal. This is it, you know, I open up, the curtains open up for me, and look, I'm letting them all go. Hold on.
It's like something like how London used to be, I look at this.
Fish Tales, the first in a new series of Inside Story. Wednesday at 10:15 on BBC1.
Juice, fresh from the orange. Croissants, fresh from the oven. Tennis, fresh from Australia. BBC Choice serves up the perfect breakfast with coverage of the Australian Open. Every morning from 7:55.
Hello you're watching BBC News 24, the latest news at 2:30. Two Britons and a Dutch couple, together with their two young children, have been kidnapped in Yemen. They were seized by an unidentified gang north of the capital, Sana'a. Unconfirmed reports suggest some of the group are hospital workers. Jeff and Jenny Bramley, the foster parents who gave themselves up after 4 months on the run with their foster children, have claimed social services left them with no option but to disappear. However, in a statement read out by their solicitor, they said they were confident it would become clear that Jade and Hannah were secure and happy with them.
As soon as we heard that the social services would allow the court to take an independent look at what was best for the children, we arranged through a relative and our solicitor to return. We are now in a safe place. The children are well and happy, and we are confident that the fact that we are very much a family with two confident, secure and stable children will become clear.
Later this morning, the Law Lords will reopen the case into whether General Augusto Pinochet should be immune from prosecution. It's the second time they've had to consider the question. An earlier ruling was set aside when one of the Law Lords failed to disclose his ties with the human rights organisation Amnesty International. 3 women who were wrongly given the all-clear by the cervical screening service at Kent and Canterbury Hospital are to go to the High Court today to seek compensation. The case could set legal standards for screening in the future. NATO has decided not to take military action following the latest massacre of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. However, 2 senior generals are being sent to Belgrade to warn the Serb leadership to comply with international demands. And the Russian President Boris Yeltsin has been admitted to hospital in Moscow, suffering from an acute stomach ulcer. A Kremlin spokesman has described his condition as stable. Those are the headlines. There'll be a full bulletin on the hour, but now it's time for Hard Talk.
My guest today has been described as the foremost British writer of his generation, and that was even a prediction made after his first book more than 20 years ago. He achieved fame by writing exquisitely about death, torture and isolation. And to crown it all, this year he won the Booker Prize. Ian McEwan, you once said that it must be hell to win the Booker Prize, is it?
Actually, it's turned out to be rather pleasurable. I take it all back. I won't hear a word said against it. I think some of my friends who've won it went on the road for a year, pressure from all their foreign publishers, and I think at that point it must become hell, being so far from, you know, actually getting on with any work. So I think I'm going to be able to steer my way through doing what's required and then getting back to, you know, the business.
Now, it was the book Amsterdam that won you the Booker. As with so many of your novels, it's a tale of contemporary morality. This time, what's the setting?
Well, it's a sort of historical novel. It's set in, well, it begins at least in February 1996, tail end of the major Thatcher years. It's 2 close friends, rather eminent in their respective spheres. One's a journalist, editor of a rather ailing broadsheet called The Judge, which is struggling to go down market to recapture its audience. And the other fellow is Clive Linley, very famous composer, very serious about his work. He's been commissioned to produce what he considers is going to be his crowning achievement, a millennial symphony. The problem with Clive is he's not very good. The reader will slowly discover, in fact, that he's a pretty hopeless composer. And the novel is partly about the gathering pomposities and vanities of early middle age that afflict quite a few of us, I think.
Will you read us a passage from it?
Yes, this is Clive at the funeral of Molly. He and Vernon are bound in their life's history by the fact that they were both lovers of Molly, as was in fact the Foreign Secretary at the time, not Douglas Hurd, completely different fellow, very much on the far right of his party. And Clive suddenly finds himself standing alone with all the mourners, so-called mourners, gabbling away as if they were at a cocktail party, except they don't have drinks. And he really reflects on his contemporaries, his baby boomers generation. Nobody else was missing her. He looked around at his fellow mourners now, many of them his own age, Molly's age, to within a year or two. How prosperous, how influential, how they had flourished under a government they had despised for almost 17 years. Talking about my generation, such energy, such luck, nurtured in the post-war settlement with the state's own milk and juice, and then sustained by their parents' tentative, innocent prosperity, to come of age in full employment, new universities, bright paperback books, the Augustan age of rock and roll, affordable ideals. When the ladder crumbled behind them, when the state withdrew her tit and became a scold, they were already safe. They consolidated and settled down to forming this or that, taste, opinion, fortune.
Now that pomposity that you refer to that afflicts men of your generation, your age, is it something you see in yourself?
Oh God, I think it is an occupational hazard. I think once other people start taking you seriously, there's a great danger you're going to take yourself sort of too seriously. I see it around me, and I hope I'm aware of it in myself when it pops up. But yes, certainly I put a little bit of myself into this foolish man, Clive Linley. I mean, there are moments, for example, when Clive has a completely inflated view of what he's about, and even begins to think that he belongs in a line of geniuses that include Darwin and Newton and Beethoven. That's who he really wants to be. And I guess, if I was really to be quite honest about it, there have been moments, not when I thought I was a genius, but when I thought, now I've really done it. This paragraph is going to be the best bit of writing I've ever done, and I finally achieved it. I've made it.
Is there a sense in which the Booker Prize confirms that?
The Booker Prize, because it has a different panel each year, is something. I mean, there's always going to be an element of lottery in it. There's always going to be an element of spinning bottle, and it stops at you or it doesn't stop at you. So again, I think you have to embrace the good fortune it brings, but not get too swept up by feeling that your book is any different from the book that was before you, 5 minutes before the announcement.
Certainly this book is very different from your earlier work. Now, I know you've brought along Black Dogs from 1992. Could you read us a piece from that?
Yes, here's a paragraph right from the very end. This is really a story of a very long love affair that spans the period from immediately after the war to more or less the fall of the Berlin Wall and beyond. And this is Jeremy, the narrator, reflecting on these dogs that his mother-in-law, June, once encountered in the south of France, and which have turned into symbols. They've become, in fact, the novel is really about the power of a metaphor. What are these dogs? What do they stand for? Were they just two dogs that were set loose on a path and she stumbled across them? Or were they, as she thought, the embodiments of evil that actually brought her from communism finally to God? And so Jeremy ends by thinking just what significance they carry. But it is the black dogs I return to most often. They trouble me when I consider what happiness I owe them, especially when I allow myself to think of them not as animals, but as spirit hounds, incarnations. June told me that throughout her life she sometimes used to see them, really see them, on the retina, in the giddy seconds before sleep. They are running down the path into the gorge of the Vis, the bigger one trailing blood on the white stones. They are crossing the shadow line and going deeper where the sun never reaches, and the amiable drunken mayor will not be sending his men in pursuit, for the dogs are crossing the river in the dead of night and forcing a way up the other side to cross the coast. And as sleep rolls in, they are receding from her, black stains in the grey of the dawn, fading as they move into the foothills of the mountains, from where they will return to haunt us, somewhere in Europe, in another time.
It is so dark, and it's still, even earlier, there's dark works, dark subjects that you covered. You covered incest, child abuse, masturbation, all such one sort of automatically wonders what your black dogs were that you wanted to write about such subjects.
I guess I was a very quiet, intense, rather inexpressive kind of teenager and child. And when I started writing in my early 20s, I was 21 when I wrote the first stories that are in my first collection. I think it was as if a lid blew off and 100 demons came out to amuse me or torment me. I never really knew where they came from. I wasn't writing in any direct way about my own life. There was a great deal of invention, but the stories still had parallels with old conflicts or memories from childhood, or things that I'd never really been able to speak about. And they exist in the stories almost in the same relation to my life as a dream might. You know, you sort of, sometimes months after writing one of those stories, I would see what it was really about in relation to my own life. I see that it was a very displaced version of something, and very heightened version of something in my own existence.
Are you embarrassed about them, in a sense, the subject matter?
I'm not embarrassed about them. In fact, I'd never pulp them or, you know, get rid of them.
But you've stopped your children reading them, haven't you?
I haven't stopped them reading them. I just don't think, you know, they're the kind of books you want to read when you're 11, you know, or 12, for that matter. But no, I would certainly, for example, I get letters from 16-year-olds about the cement garden, very animated letters. And certainly a somewhat later novel, Child in Time, which has very intense scenes in it, that's a set text for A-level. So, I mean, I don't have any condescending or patronizing view of what children should read, but I do think, you know, there are limits and lines. I wouldn't...
And as far as your parents were concerned, for them to read it?
Oh, no hesitation at all. They were grown-ups.
And you were quite happy that they saw these thoughts? And...
Yes, oh yeah.
Now that first book, the collection of short stories, the particularly dark stories that we're talking about, First Love, Last Rites, published in 1975, you were 22 as you say, immediately acclaimed. It must have put tremendous pressure on you.
You have to bear in mind that in 1975, writing fiction was actually a rather minor and somewhat sort of potty occupation. It didn't have the kind of focus of public attention that it's acquired now. You speak of acclaim, but I mean, it meant a handful of good reviews, but you know, and it sold maybe 2,000 copies. Fiction was really not quite such a sort of semi-celebrity affair. I mean, novelists now are sort of like starlets, minor starlets, or very, very minor rock and roll musicians. Then it was almost a sort of dying art. All my friends who were making it in other forms were in the theatre or in journalism or writing poetry.
Which is why, in a way, because when you wrote those stories while you were the first person to sign up to an MA in literature and creative writing at the University of East Anglia. So you knew then you wanted to be a novelist.
I knew then that I wanted to write some short stories, and I never dared think of myself as a writer at that point, not when I started that year. It was a very lucky year. The course had closed down. It was his first year. No one had applied due to lack of interest. I showed up. They took me on, Malcolm Bradbury and Angus Wilson. All it meant as a course was that I'd write a story. I'd show it to Malcolm Bradbury. We'd meet up in a pub. He would say, well, like this, don't like that. When can I see the next one? And I would go off and do another. And it'd be the same in the summer of the following year for Angus Wilson. They didn't try and bend me to their own particular tastes in writing. It was an amazing year. I had 30 stories written by the end of it. Many of them made up First Love, Last Rites. I had encouragement and a kind of audience of 2 who happened to be established novelists, with no restriction upon me at all. It was a fantastically lucky break. And how I would have fared now in a seminar of 15, as it now is at the University of East Anglia or any other writing course, where you're always looking over each other's shoulder and analysing each other's stuff and getting paranoid about who's best. I just don't know.
But certainly when you refer to it as a turning point, because when you talk about school, you were mediocre. You used to come 20th out of 30 in the class, which seems, given how clever your books are, I mean, they're just astoundingly clever. Most people would find that remarkable to think of the change.
Well, I'm one of that great legion of writers who has an English master in his past, who seem to do that magical thing that a good teacher can do, just turn the switch in you that makes you, first of all, feel perhaps you're special, perhaps you're clever. More importantly, he put me in the way of writing that really thrilled me, and spoke about it in ways that seemed absolutely contemporary, even though we were talking about Wordsworth or Alexander Pope. His name was Neil Clayton. He opened up literature as a sort of priesthood to me. In fact, for a long time, my ambition was to teach literature in university. I thought it was the only calling an intelligent person could have. So that, I mean, my turnaround, as it were, happened at school. It just happened at 16. But kids do develop at different speeds at different times. I think. There's nothing so amazing.
Your father was in the army, in the British Army. He was travelling a lot. How did you find that? Did you...
Travelling with the British Army, especially in the 50s and 60s, was like really staying in England in a rather intense way. The Army took with it, its NAFI, its YMCA, its semi-detached houses, and the Army issue furniture with the floral patterns were there in Singapore, and they'd be there in Tripoli waiting for you when you arrived. So in some curious way, it wasn't like travelling at all.
Did it make you, because you were at boarding school, did it make you close to your parents, or do you think it made you more distant, that sort of...
I wasn't at boarding school till I was 11, and in fact the years I spent in North Africa, in Libya, in Tripoli, between the ages of 5, 6, up until that time, till I was 11, I really did enjoy. And I did get a taste for Mediterranean landscape and light and heat, which has never left me. I often go, when I can, to Italy and France. Sadly, not to Libya, which is a closed place these days. So just to qualify what I say about travel, there were moments, especially in North Africa, when I really did get a taste for it.
Now, I know the description that you paint of the British Army overseas, most people then would find it surprising to hear you say that your parents, you have described your parents as very definitely working class. You don't really say very much more about them usually.
I wrote a rather close approximation to my parents in The Child in Time, actually. In fact, that's the only time I've ever put people I actually know directly into a novel. I had a brother and a sister who were much older than me and who had left home by the time I was 7 or 8 years old. So in many ways, I was like an only child. And we were a very intense triangle.
Were you lonely?
No, I had lots of very tight, close sort of friendships. And was, I guess, one of the reasons I was miserable at boarding school when I went was because I was so close to both my parents, and they were 2,000 miles away. And boarding schools in the late 50s were rather less kind places, a long time to go before the Children Act came in. Much less pleasant places than they are now.
I know you've referred to the orthodox cruelty of school. Were you bullied? Was it brutal?
I don't know. I think actually my school was better than most. It was a state-run boarding school in the most spectacular piece of Suffolk, most beautiful place overlooking the estuary of the River Orwell. It had a strangely classless air. It took mostly working class kids from central London who were having trouble at home, who had passed their 11+, and it transported them to this sort of minor public school and packed them all off to university 5 or 6 years later. It was an extraordinary success, but still it had its routine brutalities, its lack of privacy, its awful hierarchies, its obsession with games, which didn't really fade till I was in my 6th form. But actually it was not a bad place, really. It's just that, I was a rather quiet, shy boy. I was never bullied. A kind of silence came off me, I think sort of rather like a heat, and bullies rather stayed away from me. I'm not quite sure why. I think I was just too pale and too quiet.
All that you're saying about the way you grew up, I know you spend as much time as you can with your two sons now. How much has your background, I suppose, it must have enormously influenced the way that you are with them?
My father was hopeless with tiny children. I mean, even when he was a grandfather, all he could do when he was confronted with my 2 or 3-year-old sons was make very loud noises at them and see what happened. Once I was 8 or 9 or 10, he was actually very attentive and always suggesting little adventures, and he was a very considerate man, actually, very kindly. He liked to have fun, and I think I've kept that from him. I've inherited that from him. I like to do things with my children.
You do share your 2 sons with your first wife, and
Yeah.
it was a very acrimonious divorce. That cannot be easy.
No, it's not easy, but I think it's right for the children to keep the love of both parents in their lives. I think, however difficult it is for them and inconvenient for them, I think it serves the children well to know that both parents are in their lives and love them.
And almost as a result, you have this, what some might consider quite an odd setup now, in that you're spending much of your time in Oxford, near to your 2 sons. Your current wife, your second wife, lives in London.
Yes, she works for the Financial Times. Her work means she's often, even in the evenings, having to be in London. So it's all very chaotic in a way from day to day. We never quite know where we're going to be. But, you know, we make it work. I mean, there are far worse existences, I think.
Your plots, your storylines, even if children aren't central to them, there are always children involved in that. Is that influenced by your own situation?
My situation now?
Yes, in terms of the way that, how your boys influence you, your writing.
The only real influence was in The Daydreamer. It's a book I wrote partly for adults, actually, but I mean mainly for children. And I wrote each chapter to read to them at bedtime. They were sort of bedtime-length stories. And I very much treated William and Gregory as my editors. Whenever they felt that the storyline was not quite to their taste, or wasn't focused enough, or something wasn't clear, they would speak up and I would change it accordingly. So that was something of a joint effort.
Was it easier writing for children than for adults?
I think it's the only book I've ever written with a clear audience in mind. I mean, writers are always asked, do you write for a particular audience? And I always say no. But The Daydreamer was written specifically for the boys. But in fact, I had promised my stepdaughter Alice long ago that I would write her a book. So I also had her in mind for this too.
Right. Aside from that, you're fairly clearly there that you where the ideas for a children's book. Otherwise, how do you get your ideas for the stories?
I'm very patient. I leave long gaps usually between novels. I spend a lot of my time mooning around with a notebook, sometimes walking, sometimes with my feet on the table or the radiator, just waiting for the swirl of odd images and bits and scraps that are going around in my mind to begin to cohere. When I know I've got something, it declares itself with a kind of urgency. And it's a bit like deciding, you know, who to get married to. You think, well, can I live with this idea for at least 2 or 3 years, and possibly for the rest of my life be accountable to it or for it? So it has to really declare itself very strongly and seem to have roots, and seem to sort of go back a long way.
Is it the crafting and recrafting of a sentence that you like about writing, or is it just getting the story out?
I like rewriting sentences. I speak them aloud a lot. I like the taste of them. I like to test the rhythms of a sentence. I suppose the real pleasure of writing is to do with the generation of surprises. I mean, you can have a pretty clear idea of, you know, sitting down at 9 o'clock in the morning where you would like to be by mid-afternoon. You've got a rough map of what you're doing, but the real pleasure comes from the sudden surprises of either the introduction of a new character or some little thing like an image, a simile, a metaphor that seems to just come out of nowhere, an adjective-noun coupling that tickles you in some way. It's those things that did not exist when you sat down first thing in the morning.
But do you feel now that it's very much for you, it's the fact that you enjoy it, or do you have this feel that there's a mission to make things, to shock people into things that might seem familiar to them, but you want to perhaps resensitize them to?
I think the trouble with people out there is they're so diverse in their response. I mean, one person's going to tell you or write in the newspapers that your book is a piece of garbage from first page to last. Another person is going to be profoundly moved by it, and you just can't be doing with that or second-guessing it. You have to please yourself and hope that, since we're biologically rather similar, you will, in concentrating on the particular and on also what pleases you, reach whoever is open to it. I don't think you can do more than that. Otherwise, you're always thrashing about trying to please people.
Do you know the idea that you can live with for the next 2 years?
I'm almost there. Not quite. I've been...
almost there enough to tell us?
No. Like many writers, I have a deep superstition. Never start putting into words what you haven't yet put into words. Otherwise, it just blows away. Or it writes itself, as it were, even as you speak.
Are you getting better, though, as a writer?
I know more, I think. Certainly, when I began the age of 21, the kind of writing I despised was had a great deal of society in it, and one of the reasons I hated it was I felt excluded from it. So I generated my own material out of strange voices that spoke from the page. Now I'm interested in things like history, science, and hope also to keep the intensity of the short stories alive, but with a bigger palette, richer colours, a wider range of emotional feeling, and at the same time, as I say, keep an element of strangeness too, which is what I like in fiction. Clarity, precision. Those things appealed to me when I was 22, and they still appeal to me now.
Ian McEwan, good luck with the next project, and thank you very much for joining us on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
So this is how we start the week, with a band of cloud and rain and strengthening winds coming in from the west for the morning. Ahead of it, it's clear, it's going to be frosty, and there'll be some icy stretches on some of the minor roads, but a bright and dry start across the east. The rain into the west, preceded by snow over parts of Scotland and northwest of England. The rain moving steadily eastwards throughout the day, followed by blustery showers and gale-force winds in the west there. The top temperatures probably in the south and west about 9 or 10 degrees.
Washington is power. It's the home of the most powerful men and women in the world. If you can crack the code of what's going on in Washington, you can explain the world to itself. If you look at Lincoln, you see the man who took one of the most courageous decisions in the history of the United States to liberate the slaves. I was there for the Gulf War. I can remember very well the day when the ultimatum ran out, and there was this terrible calm. We got the sense that it was finally going to happen. In fact, I'd been tipped off that it was very likely to happen that night. The whole world was watching Washington, and many of them are watching through the BBC.
Gavin Esler makes the difference on BBC News 24.
This is BBC News, broadcasting to the United Kingdom and around the world. The headlines. After Friday's massacre, civilians flee more fighting in Kosovo. NATO says it won't intervene. More kidnappings in Yemen. 2 British and 4 Dutch nationals are taken hostage by armed tribesmen. And Russian President Boris Yeltsin is back in hospital, suffering from a bleeding ulcer. Hello, I'm Samira Ahmed. The NATO alliance has decided against any military action at an emergency meeting to consider its response to the killing of more than 40 ethnic Albanians in the Serbian province of Kosovo. However, NATO ambassadors meeting in Brussels did decide to send 2 top military officers to the Yugoslav capital, Belgrade.
The ambassadors from the 16 NATO countries agreed after 3.5 hours of talks to send 2 top generals to Belgrade to deliver a final warning to President Milosevic to end the violence in Kosovo. The generals, including Wesley Clark, NATO's supreme commander in Europe, will appeal to both the Serbs and the Kosovo Albanians to refrain from further military action. But it's clear that the warning is directed principally at the Serbs. Mr. Milosevic will be told he is in very clear non-compliance with the ceasefire agreement reached last October.
The Council demands that the government of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia take immediate steps to ensure that those responsible for this massacre are brought to justice. The names of those who participated in the killing and those who gave the orders must be divulged, and they must be handed over to the International Tribunal for prosecution if requested. President Milosevic must comply with all his commitments to NATO and to the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, which are based on UN Resolution 1199. The Federal Republic of Yugoslavia must bring the VJ and the MUP Special Security Forces units, their force levels and posture into compliance with the commitments given to the alliance last October. As the signatory of this agreement, President Milosevic is responsible for ensuring that these force levels are respected. He is also personally responsible for the behaviour of his security forces.
Today's meeting has put the prospect of NATO airstrikes onto the back burner, but the so-called activation order remains in force. This means that if the general's mission to Belgrade fails, the 700 civilian ceasefire monitors in Kosovo could be evacuated to prepare the way for military force to be used as soon as a political decision is taken. Angus Roxburgh, BBC, Brussels.